everybody, and welcome to Just Mitch Movies, the podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Fesser. Grab your popcorn and your soda, for the show is starting. Today, I'm going to talk about the earlier films that I watched when I was a kid, hence the title, animation. Those were the first movies that I watched very religiously as a kid. Now, this is not going to be like a history of animation. We're not going to go all the way back. I mean, we will, but it's going to be in my own history, if you will. We're going to talk about so many films in the animation style, but I'm just going to take you on a little bit of a timeline of why I love animation and how that started and how that all came to be. Animation, for me, started when I was about a year and a half, when I watched the first Toy Story. And kudos to Pixar way back in 1995, because granted, I was a year and a half, but to me, the fact that I was able to see toys walk, talk, and to see Buzz Lightyear fly around Andy's room, that was so cool to me. And I always wanted to... It's funny because after watching that movie so many times, I always had that Woody doll and that Buzz action figure. I would leave them in my room, and I would leave them in a place where only I would know where they were. And I would leave the room for like 5 seconds, and I would like peek over to see if they were like alive, kind of like what happened in Andy's room. That's what really got me started into not just animation, but also filmmaking in general. But today we're just going to talk about animation. So as I go forward, I do have to say that I'm a Walt Disney World cast member, so therefore I do not speak for the brand or the company. My thoughts and opinions are my own. So let's keep on going. From Toy Story, as I grew older, I'm going to say around 3 or 4, I would say I really started watching more of the classic Disney films, but one that really caught my eye and one that I really watched. I mean, if there was a movie that I didn't, that I did watch more than Toy Story, it would have been Walt Disney's Peter Pan. And oh my gosh, because I was just obsessed with seeing a boy fly. And seeing a boy, I mean, now granted, I didn't know how old Peter Pan was when I watched it back when I was younger, but I knew he was somebody of, I'm going to say, pre-teens. So I always thought, like, man, maybe all I need is like faith, trust, and pixie dust. But to see somebody fly for the first time, not in a plane, not with a parachute, nothing. I mean, he was flying. And I loved that as a kid. I loved being able to see somebody fly through the sky and just be present in the sky. And the reason why I love talking about Peter Pan so much is because that was, even though, yeah, Toy Story was my first foray into just films, but Peter Pan was my first taste of non-CGI animation. This was like the traditional animation that everyone grew up with back in pre-1990s, pre-CGI, pre-Pixar days. And that was my first taste of 2D traditional hand-drawn animation. It got me really thinking when I was younger that there had to be more of those films somewhere, because I also grew so close to the source material of Peter Pan and the story of Peter Pan. You know, I really, right after I watched that movie, I grew very close to the stage version of Peter Pan, but I get a little sidetracked. With Peter Pan, that was my introduction to the classic Disney films, because after I grew bored of Peter Pan, and that's one thing I have to let you guys know. The more I like watch a movie like over and over and over and over again, I get tired of it really, really quickly. I didn't right away as a kid, but I'm going to say I probably watched Peter Pan continuously, religiously for about almost a year, if I can really think about it. Because because that was the movie that I watched so much as a young child, and that was like right after Toy Story, because same thing with Toy Story, I would watch that religiously. Like, there were times where y'all probably remember this, the VHS days. Those VHSs were ran so poorly, and I'm pretty sure I broke at least one of those VHSs. I don't remember which one it broke. It may have been Toy Story, because I would rewind it, put it in again, rewind it, watch it the next day. If it was a weekend, I would watch it both Friday, Saturday, Sunday, because again, as a young kid, even though, I had a lot of things to do outside, I didn't know what else to do. I was a kid, and I also didn't know at the time that, films are so powerful, and I think that's what really got me started. And right after Peter Pan, I really started looking at, because my mom, she had a big case. It was a case full of bookshelves. And each shelf, I think I had about, I think it was about four or five shelves. And they weren't like big, but they're decent size. Each shelf had a collection of VHS tapes. And I would always, if I ever got bored, I wanted to like go through and pick out which movie I wanted to watch next. And I think after Peter Pan, the movie that I remember watching, the animated movie that I remember watching, that sticks out in my mind was Oliver and Company. When was Oliver and Company made? I think it was in the 80s. Yeah, it was like right before like the big Disney Renaissance. And that was and the reason why I touch upon Oliver and Company, not just because it was the next one, but I grew up on a farm, so I really enjoyed all the animals. And to see, again, cats and dogs talk and sing and go from like place to place. And it was really cool to see animals just, vibing and singing songs. And let's really talk about this also. Like Billy Joel as Artful Dodger, that was such an interesting casting, because no one would have pegged Billy Joel as our Artful Dodger. I'm sorry, nobody in their right mind would have made him the Artful Dodger in that. And he played it really, really well. And that music was like bopping, there were a couple times where my dad told me to quit singing what song was it? The Central Park song, and because I was singing it so bad and all the time. And my dad would just be like, no more singing. So yeah, there's that. That was a good movie. But then right after that, I think at this time I would have been 4, maybe 5. I got bored. Me and my mom were I think it was a weekend right after school. Or like I don't think I wasn't in kindergarten yet. I was in preschool, I think. Yeah, I was in pre-K. I was farting around trying to find a good movie to watch, and I found this Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and I asked my mom if we could watch it, and she said yes. And I was blown away by that movie. I'm just gonna be straight up honest. That was one of the best movies I had ever watched at the time. Period. Amen. That movie was so good. I was so scared of the Wicked Witch. I loved all the Seven Dwarfs. Snow White was my first crush as a kid, because she was like so just awesome. I loved that movie. And at the end of that movie, I think it was either at the beginning or the end, there's a little snippet of Roy E. Disney talking about Walt Disney. And I remember talking to my mom, and she goes, Mom, I said, Mom, I want to meet this Walt Disney guy. And she goes, well, sorry he passed away. And I go, that okay. But then she told me about Walt Disney World, and I said I wanted to go, and that was actually the summer we were going back in 1998. So that was really cool. But now really talked about my history, but I did want to touch upon some more history of animation, because really, if it wasn't for the history of animation, I wouldn't be able to have a history of animation myself. So now that I've finished really talking about mine, and we'll get to other non-Disney related animation films, but right now I really want to touch upon how important animation was. So really, I could talk about animation all day long, from the history to how they started with cartoons, with the Mickey Mouse cartoons and Oswald the Rabbit, Silly Symphonies. I could talk all day. I could make a podcast just on that, but I'm not going to, because everyone's talked about it, and I don't want to, bore everybody. But I think really, with animation back in the I'm going to say from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs all the way to Disney Renaissance. Before that time, before Disney Renaissance, those animated films. You got Snow White, the Seven Dwarfs, Pinocchio, Fantasia, Bambi, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty. I couldn't, as I'm older now, and I've watched those films over and over again, I can't help but wish that I grew up in that time, because those films were just, and again, yes, now audiences are used to seeing the CGI stuff, like Wish, Tangled, and don't get me wrong, those are good movies. Wish is okay, but Tangled is beautiful. Moana's great. Moana 2 is going to be amazing, and you also have great stuff coming from DreamWorks, and Sony Animation. You got the Spider-Verse films. They're all great. But at that particular time frame, that animation, the hand-drawn animation, was just so beautiful and so captivating, and really brings in the audience. And I can't help but wonder if I personally believe that all those films, they were going to be made regardless, but I wonder, the developers and Walt Disney himself, every time they would make those films, if they knew they were always making masterpieces. Now, granted, not every film that Disney's made is great, but the majority of them are, especially when it comes to animation. And I keep going back to Pinocchio back in 1940. There was now I watched Pinocchio really late, because I remember it was the donkey changing scene, and I was terrified. That was the most terrifying shot ever as a kid. I vowed to never watch that movie until I was older. It was so scary to see a kid change from a normal kid to a donkey. That's scary. But afterwards, as I grew older, I finally was able to watch it. I actually watched it a couple years ago, and there's a shot that really sticks in my mind. It was when Pinocchio is underwater. And I'm just thinking, that scene was made in 1940 and was probably drawn before that. I'm going to say probably 1938, 1939, because those movies, they took a while to be made. To think about that was 1940. That was before the United States entered in World War II. And now yes, we have CGI, everything. We got Avatar: The Way of Water. We got the CGI Lion King and all that stuff. But to see a pre-World War II animated movie have a sequence where the main character is underwater talking and interacting with fish and Jiminy Cricket. I couldn't take I could not take my eyes off my TV screen after watching that. And I just can't help but wonder what it was like being in that movie theater. And no, I get it. Pinocchio was a box office bomb back in the day. But to be an audience member and see that on the screen, I'm surprised Pinocchio is not talked about near as much now compared to the other Disney classic films of Walt Disney's time. Because that movie really, even though, yes, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, that was what put animation films on the map. But Pinocchio, people need to talk about Pinocchio a lot more, in my personal opinion. And as we go further down the pipeline, or the timeline, if you will, one other Disney film in that era that really sticks out, I would have to say, it might have been Cinderella, because Disney needed a hit, and that was it. But now, after that, nothing really sticks out to me, because, I mean, yeah, you had like The Jungle Book. I love The Jungle Book. That was great. And Winnie the Pooh, that was, everyone loves Winnie the Pooh. I've never met anybody who doesn't like the Winnie the Pooh, the Blustery Day, and all those. As I keep going, and we are going to go down that timeline, I'd have to also... Now, granted, this is not a traditional animated movie, but it has animation in it, and that's Who Framed Roger Rabbit. That was a taste for me, because I watched that when I was in my late teens, maybe early 20s. I know it came out in 88, but that was a taste for me that, animation, it can be adult, and it can be, I mean, I knew animation could be scary, but it also it could get intense, and it could also be that kind of, it doesn't have to be all fairy tales, because that movie was borderline mafia almost at times. But no, it wasn't just a mafia film. It wasn't like Goodfellas or Casino or something like that. It was an intense thriller film. So that was a taste of, not just for me, but for audiences everywhere, that, people should still, and because at the time, animation was really struggling. I remember, especially for Disney, because they had the Black Cauldron, and that, I watched that, and no wonder that movie bombed, because that was not a good movie. And I can't really remember, I don't think any studio back in the 80s was making any kind of animation. I mean, I know we had The Land Before Time. There was no studio back in the 80s making any type of animated film at all. And Land Before Time, yes, that was made by Universal in 88, but again, and that was one of Universal's first, if I'm not mistaken. And if I'm wrong, someone please correct me, but animation was struggling back in the 80s. However, I think what really made animation, keep going was, and yes, you can point to the Disney Renaissance. We'll touch that in a second. But in my opinion, if it wasn't for Pixar and Toy Story, Bugs Life, and all those films coming out from like the 1995 to really now, today, because before, Pixar never had a bomb, if you really think about that. Really, before COVID, or the Panini, Pixar never had a bomb. And that's one thing I really appreciated from Pixar. And we'll touch on the Disney Renaissance in a second, but if it wasn't for Pixar, animation would not be where it is today. And I will die on a hill. And if anyone wants to discuss that, we'll talk later. But I think also Pixar's animation style, it wasn't copied, but I feel like DreamWorks really was inspired by that kind of animation style, because Shrek was made. And that, everyone talks about, Shrek is love, Shrek is life. We love that. We love Shrek. We don't like the third and fourth, but we do love 1 and 2. But if it wasn't for Pixar, I don't think DreamWorks would have made Shrek the way that it was made. And I could see Shrek be made in a traditional animated film. I could, but I don't think it would have had near the impact that it had. Because when was that made? Was it 2002? Let me double check that. I want to say it was 2002. It was 2001. So really, Shrek came out really after... It was like right after Toy Story 2, because Toy Story 1 was 95, Bug's Life was 97, and Toy Story 2 came out in 1999, and then it was Shrek. And then there was those, because what was after? Well, that's not important. So really, once Shrek came out, that's when DreamWorks really became the kind of animation powerhouse that we all know it is. I know it's been struggling a little bit, but Shrek put DreamWorks on the map and finally gave Disney some kind of competition, which I don't want to say it was too little too late, but if Shrek would have been made back in the 80s, I don't even want to know what would have happened to Disney animation. But you also need to put into the fact that Disney did have the Disney Renaissance, which, that include classic films like Aladdin, The Lion King. And I want to touch on The Lion King, because Lion King for me was, I'm going to say I would label it in between, in terms of a film that I watched so religiously, I would place it right after Peter Pan. Because I didn't really touch upon Lion King earlier. I wanted to save that for this because it was part of the Disney Renaissance. The Lion King, for me, was a real eye-opener for a kid who didn't really understand the ways of adult life. So, because no young kid really thinks about this at this age. But as a young kid, I think I was like 5 or 6 when I first watched it. I can't remember exactly. But when you see Mufasa die, because when I was watching it, I'm like, oh, it's Mufasa. He's asleep. He's fine. But then you see that he's dead. And Scar comes up and he goes, Simba, what have you done? And then he says the king is dead. And I think it was my mom that I used to watch a lot of animation films with my mom. Was talking to her during this movie, and I said, Mom, why can't Mufasa get up? And she goes, well, Mufasa's dead. And I go, what's that mean? And that opened a big jar of something that I didn't understand, but looking back on it, it was kind of your introduction to death is always going to be embarrassing, and not embarrassing, but it's going to be tough for anybody. So to be introduced to death by a Disney animated film, it was something else. But I wasn't the only kid that was introduced to death from The Lion King. There were probably dozens of people in my state that was introduced by that. Hundreds in the United States. You're talking hundreds of people, all over the world that it was introduced to, kids that were introduced to that in a way that only an animated film could. It didn't show him die, Mufasa really die, that you don't see anything, but you see him laying there, and it's a way that kids think that he's sleeping, but that's when you find out that, okay, he's not going to wake up, he's gone. And that was really a real eye-opener for me that, oh wow, animation, they can touch upon something very serious such as death. And that was really kind of a 360, and I really got an eye opener of, not the world can kind of suck, but it helped out that it was a movie that I could watch over and over again, and it was a Disney film, because at the end, see Simba take his place and on Pride Rock, and I said, you know what, the movie had a happy ending, and it made me feel a lot better. Now, that might have finished all the Disney films, but as I go I could keep talking about Disney films forever, and who knows, I might have an episode based on that. But now I really want to talk about a few other picks, and that was two. They're from the same studio. They're the Spider-Verse films. There's Into the Spider-Verse and Across the Spider-Verse. Now, the reason why I want to talk about these is these films, I knew they were coming. I remember them being announced. I remember being disappointed that they were being made by Sony and not by Marvel. And yes, there's that deal that's going on. But these two movies, and I love both of them. I can't wait for Beyond, whenever that is going to be made, whenever that's going to be released. I have no idea. I don't even know what's going on. But those movies, to me, were so innovative in a way. And they just, when I watched both of them, I'm just like, oh my God, this animation style is phenomenal. And to see all this, so many animation, especially in Across, when there was like so many different styles for all the different universes that Miles and Miguel and Peter B. Parker and Gwen, when they visit, I'm like, oh my gosh, look how far animation's come. And that's really one of the reasons why I wanted to bring up those two, because those are the most recent ones that animation that's really been an innovative way of filmmaking. Though it was those two films, Across and Into the Spider-Verse. I personally believe that animation has now, I don't want to say it's reached its peak, but it's reached to a point where can we go now? Where can animation go now? Because now we're seeing a movie with Across, the different type of animation styles in one film. And we're seeing with CGI, we're seeing lifelike with, we have the CGI remake of The Lion King. We do have Mufasa coming out, and I don't want to count the Avatar: The Way of Water and the Avatar films as animation, because even though it's CGI, it's still, it's still kind of, in a way, a live action film. But I do want to ask you all, where can animation go from this point? Because reason why I ask, we have the traditional animation with the Disney days and the Disney Renaissance. You have the CGI with the Pixar films and the Shrek films, and now you have this really different kind of, I don't want to say it was how do I describe it? I want to describe it as more of a mix between hand-drawn, a little bit of CGI, all mixed into one. Where do we go from here? Where do you go? What do you do? How do the animation studios really, how do they make their animation films better? And sure, if you want to bring up Super Mario Brothers, cool, fine. It had a really nice feel to it. It was a good movie, but it wasn't very innovative in terms of animation. But I do have to ask you, and I'll end this episode on a question. Where does animation go from here? How do the studios make it better? How do the studios keep that fresh mindset of for us? Because back in the early days, it felt like every single animated movie had something new to show. Something, I mean, heck, you had Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. You had music. That was the first full-length film. You had right after, you had Pinocchio being underwater, and that was in 1940. And then right after that, you had Fantasia, where it was mixed, where you had so many segments mixed into one film, and that was played by an orchestra. So, what do you guys think? Where does animation go from here? Does it go to infinity? Does it go to infinity and beyond? Let me know. Now, You'll find this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you can find your other podcasts. Feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel titled Just Mitch Movies and follow on Instagram at Just Mitch Movies and TikTok at justmitch.movies. If you have any requests, go ahead and send me an email at mfester10@gmail.com. And as always, I'll see you at the movies.